Thank you for being here, Dr. Warren. We look forward to your presentation.
Apologies, some technical difficulties here. It'll just be a moment.
No worries.
Share that. All right, can everybody see my slides and hear me clearly? Okay,
Yes.
I got a nod, so we'll go with yes. So good morning, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking the event organizers for putting together such an interesting panel of speakers. For the last 15 years, I've worked with Inuit communities and organizations in Nunavut on extraction and environmental assessment. In addition to my academic research with these groups, I also frequently work as a technical advisor for municipalities and Inuit hunters and trappers organizations for environmental assessment follow-up, and land use planning types of issues. So today I'm going to draw on some of those experiences to advance some arguments about the different types of conflicts and struggles that tend to arise when mining and other forms of extraction take place on Indigenous territories. This push to rapidly expand critical mineral extraction is going to cause these conflicts to also expand and intensify with, serious repercussions for the well-being of Indigenous communities. In my opinion, conflict is near inevitable when jurisdictions attempt to use extraction to drive regional development. While compromises are frequently reached, these are usually unstable and often temporary. And as I'll explain further, these conflicts give rise to political struggles throughout the life cycle of mining projects. For the purposes of my talk today, I'm going to divide these struggles into 4 categories. The first is conflicts over proposed mining and exploration activity. The second is conflicts over the management of existing projects. The third is conflicts over project expansions, and the fourth is conflicts over project closure. And all the examples that I'm using are from Nunavut, and I've written about most of them. So if anybody wants further information, just let me know and I can send you links to some of the articles and books I've written on these topics. So to get started off, I'm just going to briefly talk about the context of mining in Nunavut. There's currently 3 mines in operation in the territory and 1 under construction. And what's more important for my talk is that mining in Nunavut is governed according to the 1993 Nunavut Agreement. This is a modern treaty signed between Nunavut and the Government of Canada. And among other things, it established a co-managed impact assessment regime and also has requirements for impact and benefit agreements between Inuit organizations and mining firms. And scholars have identified Nunavut's governance system as exemplary in terms of Indigenous participation in decisions about resources. That said, conflicts persist. So I'm going to start talking about conflicts over proposed mining and mineral exploration. These are the most well-known conflicts. They usually get a lot of coverage in regional and national media. And in Nunavut, these conflicts tend to emerge when proposed mines are in critical wildlife habitat or are otherwise deemed too risky. As Dr. Slowey mentioned earlier, there is a significant amount of support for some degree of resource extraction in a lot of these northern communities. But, being open to mining in principle is a lot different than what things actually look like on the ground once a proposal gets advanced, once a mine starts operating. So I'm going to speak to 2 examples of these types of conflicts. The first deals with successful opposition to a proposed uranium mine, and the second deals with unsuccessful opposition to mining in caribou capping grounds. So for the first example, several Inuit hunters and trappers organizations, as well as grassroots citizens groups, successfully opposed a proposed uranium mine near the community of Baker Lake. The residents were concerned with the implications of uranium mining for the environment and human health, and some groups also had concerns with the moral issues of with the end uses of uranium, specifically the potential for it to be used in nuclear weapons and the burden created by nuclear waste from nuclear reactors in southern Canada. The project was rejected after an extensive impact assessment, but it's important to note that the project wasn't just rejected because Inuit didn't want it. It was rejected because after a long process, which took a lot of time, effort, and energy on the part of Inuit to participate in. It was deemed that there was too much uncertainty in the proponents' impact predictions. So this is quite different from a community being able to provide and withhold their consent. The second type of conflict that I want to discuss here is the conflict over mining in caribou calving grounds. So Inuit hunters have repeatedly opposed proposals for mineral exploration in caribou calving grounds. Caribou are very sensitive when they give birth and nurse their calves. There's been a lot of political energy spent trying to turn these into protected areas, which hasn't really worked out. Part of this is because disturbance during this critical stage in a caribou life cycle can affect the health of the entire herd. You can see herd numbers decline and drop, and this is something that both Western science and Indigenous knowledge tends to agree upon, in my experience from talking with both scientists and hunters, is that this is a critical phase in their life cycle and a critical habitat to protect. It's also important to note that First Nations that harvest from the migratory herds that give birth in Nunavut also oppose extraction in Nunavut's calving grounds. So this is an issue that doesn't just affect one adjacent mining community. This affects communities in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. There's a large number of communities that are reliant on these herds for their well-being. And there's a long history of exploration in these areas, but so far no actual mining. Almost every exploration permit that gets assessed has a great deal of opposition, but they still just keep getting approved and approved and approved. So this is a battle that Inuit hunters are largely losing as time goes on. And it's important to note that the most advanced project in Nunavut's calving grounds right now is a combined nickel, copper, and zinc project. It's classified as Nunavut's kind of premier critical minerals project. So we're likely to see conflicts of this sort continue as these critical minerals discussions continue. So I'd like to move on to talk about the conflict over the management of existing mines. So these conflicts are a little bit less well known. They don't tend to get as much coverage within regional media, but they're no less important. Some critical questions that come up during these points are the mitigation measures, right? Those measures that are supposed to reduce the negative implications of mining for human health and the environment. Are they being properly implemented and enforced? Or are they even sufficient to protect the health and well-being of people and the environment? Mining companies, in my experience, tend to resist and sometimes just avoid mitigation measures that affect production and profitability. These conflicts often end up within bureaucratic mechanisms for impact assessment follow-up. And while there are a public record for these debates, there's almost no evidence of public participation. So a lot of this stuff takes place behind closed doors and out of the purview of the public, but conflicts still persist. And I'll use the example of conflicts over caribou protection at the Whaletail Gold Mine. So this is a gold mine near the community of Baker Lake, and it's owned and operated by Agnico Eagle, a Canadian gold mining company. And so when the Whaletail mine was first proposed, the company repeatedly said over and over they would do zero harm to caribou. It was a kind of catchphrase of theirs during the impact assessment, including a promise to close the haul road when caribou migrate through the area. However, rather unsurprisingly, shortly after the mine was approved, the company found that road closures were affecting productivity and profitability. They ditched all that rhetoric about zero harm and replaced it with rhetoric about economic realities and attempted to unilaterally change the requirements for road closures. They stopped doing road closures when they were required. They weren't implementing the mitigation measures in their management plans as it was laid out in the management plans. However, fortunately, they were forced to reconsider this approach after pushback from Inuit organizations, as well as a formal investigation ordered by the Government of Canada. As it stands now, there's still kind of open debate over what the future of this project and the mitigation measures are going to look like. But the point is that this is an ongoing discussion, it's an ongoing conflict, and it's an ongoing problem for Inuit hunters. Next, I'm going to talk about conflicts over the expansion of existing mines. So it's not uncommon for companies to insist on production increases after a mine begins operations. Usually they argue that such expansions are necessary to ensure profitability and the stability of operations. However, higher levels of production can increase ecological disturbance. And a key question in this context is, are these expanded production levels acceptable in terms of ecological disturbance and risk? And now politically, I find these conflicts some of the most interesting because mining companies are already operating and presumably employing local labor. Communities are often divided when we're talk about these struggles over mine expansions. There's usually less unity. And part of the reason for that is because companies can use threats of project closure to coerce communities into accepting unwanted expansions. This is something we see over and over in Nunavut, using that sort of nuclear option of, well, if you don't agree to what we have, then we're just going to shut the operations down and lay everybody off. Yet despite this, communities have still found ways to resist, and sometimes successfully. A clear example of that comes from the Phase 2 expansion of the Mary River Iron Mine in Nunavut. Um, Owned and operated by Baffinland Iron Mines, Mary River is located near the community of Pond Inlet. When the mine first came into production in 2016, it was shipping 4.5 million tons of ore per year. However, shortly after production commenced, the proponent applied successfully for an increase to 6 million tons per year. And this was followed by the proposed Phase 2 expansion, which would have, again, doubled production up to 12 million tons a year. Now, Phase 2 was opposed by hunters in Pond Inlet and other nearby communities, mostly out of concern that increased shipping was going to have detrimental effects to marine mammals and caribou. They were already experiencing effects on narwhal, especially, noticing fewer and fewer narwhal in their hunting grounds. Each year, hunters were having to travel further and further, spend more money on gasoline and other supplies to harvest than they usually would have. And that really was kind of the heart of the reason for this opposition. Now, the company responded to opposition, unsurprisingly, by threatening to shutter the mine and lay off its workforce, which caused some Inuit organizations to reconsider, become slightly more open to the idea of doubling production. But this changed with a blockade by grassroots hunters. They blockaded the airstrip at the mine for a couple of weeks, which caused a bit of a political crisis in Nunavut and kind of galvanized opposition to the project. Which, like the uranium mine I spoke about, this project was ultimately rejected after a long impact assessment process. But again, it wasn't because Inuit were withholding their consent. It was because of uncertainty in the proponents' impact assessment predictions. And it took years of participation of Inuit to get to that result. It's not like they could just simply say no and that would be the end result. So a final type of closure that I want to talk about are conflicts over mine closure. So these conflicts tend to arise when mines are abandoned by mining companies. Now, while companies are required to post securities, the sufficiency of these funds is often questionable, and the sort of regulatory mechanism for posting securities is largely inaccessible to the public. It takes place outside of the impact assessment process, and there isn't the same level of public involvement in these debates, which is quite problematic. Now, the conflicts that we see tend to revolve around who is responsible for the cleanup of abandoned mines and mineral exploration projects. And I'd like to use the example of the abandonment of the Jericho diamond mine to kind of get at this. So the Jericho mine, located in the Kitikmeot region of Nunavut, that's in the Western Arctic, started producing diamonds in 2008. It shuttered production in 2010, only to resume production again in 2012. It was kind of an on-again, off-again mine that was struggling to produce profits. But in 2012, Sheer Diamonds, then owner of the project, just ceased to exist as a company. They went bankrupt. Their website went online. They canceled their phone line. There was no way to reach or contact them. Workers were left laid off without their last paychecks, and the mine was just left sitting there with like explosives on site, a giant open pit, a lot of other environmentally damaging things in the area. And since that time, it's been over a decade, and there's an ongoing lengthy legal battle between the federal government and the Regional Inuit Association over responsibility for cleanup. The headline here was from earlier this year, where a judge ruled that Canada does have some responsibilities towards cleaning this up rather than just leaving it in the hands of the Inuit organization to do so themselves. That said, the litigation is still in process. All that was really ruled was that Canada can be a party to this legislation, not that they're ultimately responsible and need to clean things up. So this is something we're likely to see in the coming years and possibly even decades. So I'll just wrap up with a few closing thoughts. Even in a jurisdiction like Nunavut with strong co-management institutions and requirements for impact and benefit agreements, mining is still associated with conflict and political contestation. These conflicts and political struggles occur during all stages of the mining life cycle, including impact assessment, project operations, and post-closure. And the social implications of ongoing conflict in northern Indigenous communities is an effect of mining that's rarely accounted for in impact assessment processes. Like, we usually talk about communities as these cohesive wholes that either support or don't support a project. But when it really comes down to it, these things get incredibly divisive, especially when we're talking about project expansions. And that has serious social implications for families, social networks, and the like. And these implications usually go unexplored during impact assessment processes and other formal decision making. Some more closing thoughts to tie this back to critical minerals a bit more. Energy transitions, with an emphasis on as they are currently conceived by the Canadian state, are likely to expand and intensify conflicts such as these. Several of the projects I discussed today are included on the Government of Canada's critical mineral list, right? I mentioned mining in Caribou Calving Grounds, that nickel, copper, zinc mine. Uranium is on the critical mineral list, and after a lot of lobbying from Baffinland iron mines, the government has now added high-quality iron ore to the critical mineral list. So several of these projects would be categorized as critical today. As a result, for a truly just transition, I think we need to find a way to end fossil fuel use that don't rely on a massive expansion of mineral extraction. Energy transitions don't have to equate to a massive expansion of extraction. If we focus instead on recycling instead of mining, public instead of private transit, and ending planned obsolescence. This current demand that we're seeing isn't just a result of energy transitions writ large. It's the result of a very specific accumulation strategy by mining companies and the technology sector. And if we think a little bit more broadly about what an energy transition could be, I think a lot of this concern with expanded critical mineral extraction would end up being moot at the end of the day. So that's all I have to say for today, and I'll end it there. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.